Our next speaker is Dr. Mark Parsons, Executive Director of EPCC and Associate Dean of the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Mark Parsons joined EPC, the Supercomputing Center at the University of Edinburgh, in 1994 as a software developer working on several industrial contracts following a PhD in particle physics undertaken on the LEP accelerator at CERN in Geneva. In 1997, he became the center's commercial manager and subsequently its commercial director. Today, he is EPCC's Executive Director and also the Associate Dean for E-Research at Edinburgh. He has many interests in distributed computing, ranging from its industrial use to the provision of pan-European HPC services through the PRACE research infrastructure. His research interests include highly distributed, data-intensive computing and novel hardware design. Today, Dr. Parsons' presentation will focus on exascaling AI. Dr. Parsons, welcome. You may now begin.
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me all?
Yes, we can.
Good, I see people nodding. That makes me happy. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for asking me to talk. So I was given the title Exascaling AI, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the UK around preparing for Exascale, and also how I see Exascale and AI being synonymous with each other, in fact. So I think I want to start actually by pointing out that supercomputing centers are changing. Over the last 5 years, my organization, EPCC, which is the University of Edinburgh, has grown from 70 to over 110 staff. And we've moved away just from doing HPC and, in fact, being funded a lot by European projects into much more focusing on supercomputing and data services. And a huge amount of our funding today and projects come in the data side of what a supercomputing center is. And in fact, nearly all of my 40 additional staff are data scientists, whereas in the past we were predominantly HPC people. So these are big changes, and they're driven by the changes in technology that we're seeing as well. We're right on the cusp of the exascale era, and I have to say that I would class Fugac as the first of the exascale systems. It might not do a double precision exaflop, but it certainly manages a single precision exaflop, or an AI flop, as we keep calling them. Where we are in terms of who's going to do what when is a little bit unclear. I saw a presentation a couple of years ago now in Edinburgh where the Chinese looked likely to do an exascale system in 20 or 21. Obviously, we've got Fugac, which I'll talk about more as we go through this talk. The USA's got more than just Frontier and Aurora announced now. We also got El Capitan and some other large systems. I think we'll be looking to 22 for services to open on these systems, but America certainly is joining the exascale era. And in Europe, of course, we've just seen the pre-exascale hosting sites chosen earlier this year: Finland, Spain and Italy. And those countries and the Euro HPC organization are in the middle of finalizing the pre-exascale systems that will begin to be installed in 2021. And of course, Europe is developing its own processor, and future exascale systems will be deployed from, I think, probably around 24, late 24 now. So the UK needs to have a plan as well, and we can't allow the UK to be left behind. Our scientists, if they can't get their compute in the UK, will go elsewhere, and there's good evidence to show that scientists move quite often to where they can get the best resources for their science. So the government, of course, realizes this, and in 2018 established an Exascale Project Working Group, which developed over the last 2 years a business plan, business case for investment in Exascale in the UK. In parallel, as Mark Wilkinson said in his talk, there was an e-infrastructure review by UKRI, like the NSF in the US, led by EPCC, that looked at all different aspects of the e-infrastructure we need to do science in the UK. And as part of that, Mark Wilkinson has led the development of the computing science case that he was talking about earlier. So, when you're developing a business case, you have 4 fundamental questions, particularly around exascale. Do we need the capability? What would an exascale computer look like? How much would it cost? How will it be funded? And how will it be hosted? And the business case answers all these questions with various options and timescales and funding profiles, etc., etc. I won't go into this in any detail, but this is the science case that Mark talked about earlier and the various themes that we focused on. And it's very similar to what's happened in the USA and Japan as those countries have been making their cases. The UK government was actually quite interesting to deal with in this context because from the very beginning, it didn't want the system just to focus on a modelling and simulation. It had to focus on artificial intelligence and deep learning applications. In some respects, that might impact the technology choices you make. But as Simon was just pointing out, actually, many of the future technologies we're now looking at blur this distinction. The other aspect of it that hasn't been stressed before, certainly in the purchase of scientific HPC systems, is that this system should support both the scientific user communities and industry users. And so that's been a key part of the discussion, in particular small companies, and lots of thought around collaboration and the development of a large software program to support it. And it should also be operational by 2023. I think given the COVID pandemic and where certain technologies are going to appear, I could see that slipping by a year or so. But the aim is still to try and have an exascale capability within this Parliament. So one of the things that's not talked about very much is the complexity of preparing to host very large systems. And as an example, this is a picture of the new computer room we've been building over the last 2 years at Edinburgh at my data centre. The bit at the very top, the building at the top is where Archer, the National HPC Service, sits today, and various other services. The DRAC, large parallel system, Tesseract is here, for example. And this is a big custom-built room for about 270 normal-sized racks, cost of £20 million. And we're also adding, you can't see it because it's not built, but coming in on the left where the car park is at the moment, will be a new substation that will increase our power to site to 38 megawatts, so up to 30 megawatts for this new computer room. And these are big bits of investment and complex investments, and quite often the need for long-term strategic planning is forgotten, I think. You can't just magic these power supplies in a year or so. They take much longer than that in terms of planning and then actually all the cabling being put in. The other thing that is a hot topic, and I think is going to become more and more a hot topic for our world, is the environment. And there's a big program, or many big programs coming on in the UK around aiming for net zero. One thing I would say is that all of the national HPC services, Archer, DRAC and others at the ACF, are already using 100% green electricity. But in future we want to try and reuse our heat better. And we have a plan at the moment to heat the mine water under the city of Edinburgh and use that as a heat battery where we can then draw the heat out where businesses and homes are in south-east Edinburgh. So this is a novel application of this sort of technology, but it means hopefully we'll be able to reuse the heat as well. So I think it's instructive to look at where we are today. So until last June, the Summit system was the world's fastest supercomputer. And when it came out in 2018, I think everybody was really, really stunned by it. It's a very impressive piece of hardware. Its peak performance, just over 200 petaflops, 2.4 million CPU cores, 27,000 GPUs, but a power consumption of 13 megawatts. And of course, if you want to reach the exascale with this technology, then you're looking at 12 million CPU cores, 68,000 GPUs, and 65 megawatts. and coping with extremely high levels of parallelism. So while Summit showed how we should think about getting to the exascale, the technology itself would be very expensive to actually build an exascale supercomputer from. The Fugac system took that crown in 2020, and it takes a very, very different approach. It's based, as Simon was saying, around the A64FX ARM CPU that Fujitsu has built. And it's a very interesting story around how this was done. If you talk to Satoshi Matsuoka at Riken, you see that the whole co-design strategy actually was a 10-year program of work together with Fujitsu. You know, really looking at the sort of needs their codes had, trying to work out with the sort of silicon design that would come about over the last few years, how that process could best meet that need. And so Fugac has ended up with 7.3 million ARM CPU cores, 4.8 petabytes of RAM. It's got our peak of 213 petaflops, and it uses 28 megawatts. And certainly with what they call AI flops nowadays, it's in excess of 1 exaflop. So a very, very impressive computer. I think it's also instructive when we're having these sort of presentations to look at, you know, where all of this has been going, because this points to some of the challenges that we've all had in thinking about the exascale. So if you look at this plot, which I've borrowed from a paper, you can see the attribution at the bottom. You can see, in fact, that transistor counts in silicon devices actually are happily and merrily following, or close to following, Moore's law as much as they ever have. I mean, that graph has not changed and is not changing at the moment. But you do see, as we get into the last few years, certainly since the middle of the 2000s, that we reached this peak frequency. We reached, or at least single thread performance certainly began to tail off. Processor manufacturers started designing to a particular power envelope per socket. And to get around all this, because features on silicon were still getting smaller, we entered this age of many-core computing. And all of our challenges around exascale, and the reason why it's been such a big challenge compared to the leap from terascale to petascale, relates to what we've seen over the last decade in microprocessor design. Now, I want to focus a little bit in this talk around AI, and I know that most of you are experts in this area, but I think it's useful just to talk about GPUs for a second. So, the power of GPUs in our world really comes about from the fact that computer graphics rely on matrix multiplications. And so, all of them support what's called general matrix multiplication operations, GEM. And these all take the form of the multiplier of two arrays in B, adding one on to form a result. And for computer graphics, generally these operations are at low precision, so 16-bit floating point. And it turns out, of course, and we all know this now, that for deep learning, precision isn't terribly important. And so these highly parallel devices, but with low precision FPUs on them, but just lots of them, work really well for deep learning algorithms. And that's really what's driven the use of GPUs in our world of modeling and simulation, particularly as the floating point units have grown to support 32-bit and 64-bit precision. That doesn't mean they're easy to program, of course, because they expose an awful lot of parallelism, but they've become, I think, a very, very interesting and important part of the exascale story. But of course, CPUs, traditional processors, also can excel in floating point arithmetic largely designed around double precision, of course. But many processor designs, and we saw this first in Intel land, for example, with Cascade Lake, have added in 16-bit operations. Some have started using this bfloat16 format. And some are also adding in matrix-matrix multiply and accumulate operations. And so this means that in some cases, CPUs can do many of the things at a significant fraction of the performance of a GPU. They're never going to get to the same performance as a GPU in total. But the gap between a CPU and a GPU is certainly less today than it was a few years ago. This is a slide I borrowed off Nick Dubé at HPE, which actually lets us look at some of the challenges of GPU computing. So these are a number of US systems over the past decade. These numbers focus on memory and not on disk. And if we look over on the left here, you look at Hopper and Sequoia, and you see that the memory bandwidth divided by the number of flops is very high, close to 1, it's Campbell number. The flops to memory ratio is reasonably high. It's another one of these Amdahl numbers. And the ability to move data into the processor is also very high. But as we move to Summit, and this is just an example of many GPU-based systems, you see that these ratios really fall off. And remember, it's logarithmic on the left. So you're becoming memory bandwidth constrained, but also your ability to move data around is not anywhere near what was possible in Hopper and Sequoia, for example. So this is why people struggle in these large GPU-based systems. Now, it's not the end of the road, I think, because if you look at many GPU-based exascale designs, of course, people are looking for the first time now at single address spaces, at high bandwidth memory, etc., etc. But this has certainly been one of the key challenges of the exascale age. So, in many ways, I think that the technology choices of exascale break down into really two routes. One is this cores-only route favored by Japan, which I think, and I'll try and show in the next few slides, does lead to longer system lifetimes. But systems are quite large, potentially, and have large power requirements. You may not also get nearly as much benefit for deep learning as you do in other systems. The core plus accelerator route, which I think is favored by the USA based on the systems that have all been announced to date, which is a typical multi-core processor coupled to an accelerator or more. The sweet spot, and I'll discuss this later in this talk, really focuses on 1 socket and 4 GPUs. And obviously, there's strong AI performance, but traditional simulation is much more challenging. And it's really interesting. I put this slide together, and it's a merge of the EPCC results from both June 2019 and June 2020 because the K computer has disappeared. But you can see that even today, if the K computer hadn't been turned off, it would still be 22 in the top 500, almost a decade since it was first opened. It would be number 5 in HPCG. If we look at Summit, yes, 200 petaflops, second in the world, both for HPCG and HPL. Rmax to Rpeak is okay, but its HPCG fraction is really, really poor. And this is where you see the challenge of finding real performance in a GPU cores environment. Fugaku, on the other hand, has got really quite high Rmax to Rpeak ratio. But look at the HPCG results, much, much better. And that's because Fugaku has been designed around modeling and simulation applications, which I think is a really important lesson. Coming back to AI, this is the HP's Plainfield blade, which in fact was co-designed by in Japan with HPE. And what you can see here is a very, very common model we have nowadays in many systems, which is 4 GPUs and 1 or 2 traditional CPU processors. And you can see, looking at this diagram, how the real focus here is on moving data onto the GPUs, making sure it flows quickly into their memory space, and also allowing them to communicate very quickly. This is a really important model, and this is the sort of model that we'll see again and again in Exascale. So just to summarize, without giving away any great detail on where we're all going, and a number of you will have already seen these sorts of presentations, if you go and talk to the vendors about where technology is going, it's clear that high bandwidth memory is coming along. Some designs have no DRAM at all. Fugac doesn't have DRAM. We've got really a four-way competition for CPUs and or GPUs in Intel, AMD, various ARM processors, and NVIDIA. GPUs are getting ever more powerful, and of course the market's broadening because we've got AMD and NVIDIA and Intel in the future, all competing in the GPU space. Cabinet energies are rocketing, maybe 300 plus kilowatts in a cabinet. So density of blades is a key battleground. And as I said earlier, multi-core CPUs are getting AI deep learning features. Various designs have been done over the last year when I've been talking to vendors, and it will be perfectly possible over the next 3 or 4 years to get to an exaflop using a cores-only approach with 4 to 5 million cores. And that's important because Archer 2 has got 750,000 cores. So in many ways, if we're going in the cores-only approach, Archer 2 really is a pre-Exa system. We can explore many of the parallelism challenges on that system. What we don't have in the UK is a really big cores plus GPU system. And if we are going to go down that route for the Exascale, we definitely need to work out how we prepare, as Simon was saying, our codes for the world that we will enter. Exaflop power ranges from around 20 megawatts up to 160 megawatts. I've put 30 megawatts into the room that I've built. I think that will be sufficient, I hope. And then the number of cabinets ranges from 60 to over 800 in these designs from various vendors. And the density of systems is clearly an issue because we can't just go building bigger and bigger rooms. And I think the key metric in all this must be its usefulness for science and industry. Finally, one thing I did want to mention was, as Simon said, we're entering this interesting moment where people are building really interesting accelerators. Simon talked about GraphCore, and here's another example of a very, very innovative system, not dissimilar to GraphCore, which has got 400,000 sparse linear algebra cores, 1.2 trillion transistors, this massive 21 centimeter square silicon wafer. The internal interconnect is 100 petabits per second with 18 gig of RAM, of SRAM on chip. And it's got 1,200 gig Ethernet interfaces to move data onto it. And you program it using TensorFlow, PyTorch, etc., everything that the deep learning world would expect. So I think, the future is really, really exciting, not just in Exascale, but also in all of the different processor technologies that are coming along. I think in all of this, be it AI, be it modeling and simulation, be it Exascale, be it smaller systems, really what we're talking about here is our ability to move data onto and off the processors as quickly as possible. So really, supercomputing and data science have converged because we're all trying to solve exactly the same problem. So it's really data processing performance, not flops, we should be measuring future. I think that Exascale is driving a lot of the technology development, but so are the AI applications that use large amounts of data, like self-driving cars, like natural language processing, etc., etc. And I think it's very, very interesting that the cloud hyperscaler world and the supercomputing world are converging. When you look at what some of the really big cloud companies are doing, when they are doing their big AI systems, it's exactly these sort of technologies that they're using. Thank you very much.